It has been an absolutely packed week at the highest levels of government. We're talking about a major constitutional showdown at the Supreme Court, some quiet but really significant new laws, just a whole flurry of action. So today, we're going to unpack all of it. So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with a quick overview of everything that went down. Then we'll dive into a critical legal battle over presidential power. After that, we're shifting gears to the economy. Then we'll look at some big plans for future tech, and we'll wrap up with a really interesting moment of historical reflection. To really get a handle on the scope of this past week, I think it really helps to see it all laid out. The sheer range of topics that were on the table in just a few days, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, look at this timeline. You've got the administration dealing with historical land rights, pushing for next-gen technology, celebrating a new branch of the military, and at the same time getting tangled up in a major legal fight, all while putting out new economic analysis. It's a real whirlwind of activity, for sure. Okay, so let's get into what was probably the biggest constitutional clash of the week. This case really gets to the heart of a fundamental question. What are the actual precise limits of presidential power, especially when you're talking about a crisis right here at home? So here's what kicked it all off. The president federalized the Illinois National Guard. Now, according to the government's filings, this was a direct response to what they described as significant resistance and violence against federal immigration officers and property there in the Chicago area. And the entire legal battle, the entire thing, hangs on this one statute. But it's even more specific than that. The whole case turned on how you interpret just a couple of key words: regular forces. What on earth do they actually mean? And this is where we get to the central disagreement. The government's argument was that regular forces means it's civilian law enforcement. Think ICE officers. But the courts, they leaned toward a totally different interpretation, that it means the actual U.S. military. And that distinction, well, it's absolutely critical, because it completely changes the rule book for when a president can take this kind of action. Well, the Supreme Court's majority opinion landed on this interpretation. So what this means in practice is that before a president can call up the National Guard for domestic law enforcement under the specific law, they first have to be unable to get the job done with the regular military. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Justice Kavanaugh agreed with the final decision, but he wrote a separate opinion. He was worried that the majority's reasoning could accidentally tie a future president's hands if they needed to respond really fast to some kind of crisis that nobody sees coming. And this quote right here, it just perfectly illustrates the other side of the coin. The dissent, which was led by Justice Alito, really zeroed in on the evidence of violence the government presented. He detailed the chaos and the real danger that federal officers were facing, and basically argued that this is exactly the kind of situation that warranted the president's action. All right, let's pivot from the Supreme Court over to the economy. This week, the White House dropped an economic report that looks at inflation not just as a national problem, but through a very, very political lens. So this map from the report pretty much tells their whole story at a glance. The main takeaway they're pushing is that states they've labeled liberal, shown there in blue, have, on average, seen higher year-over-year inflation than the states they've labeled conservative, in red. And when you look at the numbers behind that map, you see how they break it down. Now, you can see some differences in things like housing and transportation, but the really dramatic gap, the one that jumps off the page, is in energy costs. We're talking a 2.4 percentage point difference. That suggests a really significant split in how energy prices are hitting people in different parts of the country. So this is the million-dollar question, right? This entire analysis, the whole argument, it all hinges on how you classify the states. How exactly do the authors of this report define what makes a state liberal or conservative? Because, the methodology here is everything. And the answer, believe it or not, is buried in a footnote. The report doesn't look at who controls the state legislature or what economic policies are in place. Nope. The labels are based solely on which presidential candidate won that state in the 2024 election. It's a choice that directly links inflation rates to partisan outcomes, and it basically turns what looks like an economic analysis into a political statement. So it wasn't all about the battles of today. The administration also took some really concrete steps this week with a clear eye on tomorrow, focusing on making sure America stays in the lead when it comes to the technologies of the future. First up, a presidential memorandum laid out a whole national strategy with a very bold, very clear goal. America has to lead the world in 6G. We're not just talking about faster phones. This is the next frontier of wireless that's going to power everything from AI to advanced robotics. Now, a huge part of that strategy comes down to something called spectrum. You can think of it like the invisible highways that all our wireless signals travel on. This memorandum directs federal agencies to start clearing out this specific, super valuable slice of the airwaves so it can be used for commercial 6G. And then the very next day, we heard a really similar message about future readiness, this time in a statement for the 6th birthday of the U.S. Space Force. It really hammers home this need to be prepared for threats that might come from space itself, framing it as this whole new arena for national security. You know, amid all the high stakes court cases and all the high tech future planning, the president also took a moment for something much quieter, but historically really powerful. This new law, the Wounded Knee Massacre Memorial and Sacred Site Act, it tackles a very long-standing issue. It tells the Department of the Interior to hold this land in what's called a restricted fee status for the Ogallala and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes. Basically, that means the land is held in trust, giving the tribes much greater control and protecting it from being sold or developed. By signing this bill into law, the administration took a real, tangible step toward a kind of historical reconciliation. It's formally protecting a place of deep historical and cultural pain, but also incredible significance for the Sioux tribes. It's one of those moments where policy and history just intersect. So when you step back and look at the whole week, what does it all tell us? From a huge Supreme Court showdown over the limits of power, to a politically charged economic report, and from a race for technological dominance to a quiet act of historical justice, it really shows a presidency fighting on multiple fronts at the exact same time. And it raises a really big question for all of us. How do all these seemingly separate actions, from the really loud and visible to the quiet and historic, how do they all come together to shape where we're headed as a country?